So good afternoon. Welcome. You're joining Innovate BC here with Can Do. We're honored that you've joined us this afternoon, wherever you're joining from. I hope the sun is shining, if not in real life, metaphorically. I hope that you're finding some sort of sunshine in your world today, just reminding you that creator's goodness is all around. So welcome. My name's Michelle. I'm honored to introduce in a moment our two guest speakers. But before we get started, it's always important that we, honor creator. We take a moment, we press pause in our busy minds, our busy schedules. The season is changing. So we just want to press pause and give thanks and extend gratitude to creator. So we just take this moment and we acknowledge that sun rising in the east this morning is creator meeting us. Creator met us for another day. And we are just reminded of all the gifts that are around us. Here in Edmonton, the sun is shining. The leaves are starting to change color. The land is beautiful. I think of the animals that cross my path. I got a rabbit in my neighborhood, my relative who always, I feel it comes to visit me. So we never walk alone. So we just give thanks to creator for all of the gifts that have been given to us. And so we're thankful for all of our relations, all of our relatives. So hi, creator. All right, well, let's get today started. So there is going to be opportunity for questions. Our guest speakers are okay if you have questions throughout today's presentation. So you can drop them in the chat box and we'll notify the ladies of any questions that you might have. And even at the end, there might be some space for more questions, for more conversation, for story or dialogue. So we would love to hear your voice as well. I know you've come here, with expectations of hearing our guest speakers, but we also love to use this platform for dialogue. So welcome. We're honored you're here. Today's conversation is measuring what is meaningful, integrating Indigenous knowledge into socioeconomics and community-based indicators. So our two guest speakers, we got Christy, who's joining us from BC, my apologies. And then we got Paula, who's joining us from Calgary. So the webinar today is you're going to engage in conversation on how the integration of Indigenous knowledge can improve outcomes for government, industry, and communities. Topics discussed are why is this important, how the relationship can and has changed from exploitative to mutually beneficial, and how to look forward and backwards for guidance. Awesome. So a little bit about Christy, and then Paula's gonna introduce herself. So Christy has authentically navigated both Indigenous and non-Indigenous worlds while working in the resource sector for over 25 years. So she is a wealth of good knowledge here. Her work is deeply rooted in reconciliation and decolonizing the approach to ways of doing business. Engaging and building good relationships are at the core of what Christy does as a changemaker, a mentor, liaison, project manager, and environment expert. So she has facilitated workshops, presented at national mining conventions, instructed at universities, mentored Indigenous entrepreneurs. She's just done a lot. We're honored you're here. She also is a mother. Did I see that you were a mother here? I'm just trying to scan my notes here.
9.
Wow. So we got this powerhouse of a woman here along with Paula. So we welcome you ladies. We're honored you're here. I know time is precious. I know we're busy lives, but we really, really honor the knowledge that you bring to the table today. So I'm going to pass the mic off to you and we say welcome.
G'day, Isla. Paula, you can introduce yourself.
Well, first off, thanks, Michelle. you are like your own little ray of sunshine for everybody. So if you're in a cloudy territory, oh my goodness, that you are like bright and shiny. So thank you for the energy that you're bringing today. That's really great. Yeah, so Christy is a super hard act to follow after that, and I'll be quick. So I'm Paula Salter. I work with Christy at Falkirk Environmental Consultants. I've been working with Indigenous communities for the past couple of years. I am not Indigenous. I am the daughter of a Chinese immigrant and of a white settler from Ontario. And I grew up just outside of Edmonton and in Treaty 6. And now I find myself in Calgary, which is the Blackfoot Confederacy. So that's Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, Tsuut'ina, Yagnakoda nations, and the Métis Nation. And yeah, both Christy and I are really excited to be here and to talk about something that's really important to both of us. So I'll let you start, Christy.
Yeah, and just a bit of a shout out to Indy City, because Michelle and I are both sporting the earrings. For anybody that's in love with Indy City and the earrings. Slightly obsessed. All right. So yeah, anytime anybody wants to jump in and have a question or interject with a thought, this is just to stimulate a lot of dialogue, and you know, it's in a changing field. So I think that's a really important piece to remember. So I'll share my screen. We'll go through some stuff. I have the screen here. So if I'm looking up to my left corner, it's just the way the setup is, and I can't seem to change it. So bear with me. And Paul and I are going to tag team to share some insight, and we'll get going. All right. So I now have to figure out how to turn it there. So a couple things. We wanted to talk about why this is important. The integration of more, and I guess there is always integration of some Indigenous factors when we were talking about community-based indicators and socioeconomics, but it's been really an old school approach for a lot of years. And in the last little while, we've seen a total transition for a multitude of reasons to have a stronger and more community-based approach to the work that we do, which is exciting. Something that both Paul and I have been advocating, and our team have been advocating for a very, very long time. And so one of the questions that we have, you know, like, what are the driving factors that have changed how Indigenous knowledge is valued today? You know, we can identify that we've had a multitude of changes in legislation with UNDRIP, specifically in BC, changes to the environmental assessment process, and we're starting to see those across Canada, on how projects are getting pushed through the regulatory system, and the expectation of a more robust analysis on socioeconomics, community-based indicator work, and of course, again, specific in BC, but it does affect the rest of the country, cumulative effects. And so we've recently had several court cases that are kind of meandering through how we can apply those court cases in the work that we're doing and how it affects our specific area of interest. And how, I guess the second question we wanted to point out is how is this field changing as a result of Indigenous knowledge? And I really feel that we're on just a minute little stepping stone of much grander things to come. I think we've been working really hard to have change happen, and we're starting to see this slowly evolve. I see some really good things coming out of Ontario. I see a lot of great things coming out of the East. in the north, into the Yukon. And so as we are progressing through these types of changes, we're going to see much greater, like, brilliant work coming out of the incorporation of Indigenous knowledge in Western science, which is super important. And there needs to be a consideration from the world in its entirety. And this has been pulled out of something that Paula just was recently working on, and Fauzi, another colleague of ours, which means under the earth, in the earth, above the earth, the water in all its forms, the winds and the skies. So really taking this broad, holistic perspective with the incorporation of human elements into the work that we do. So I'm just going to stop there and let Paula interject with any additional comments on that slide.
Yeah, for sure. So, I think, right now, over the past couple of years, but really it hasn't been that long, we're in a real period of change, right? Like, we're in this real time of transformation of, how we understand the world that we're in, the kinds of things that we're looking at to create meaning and that are valuable. And this is really a time with like Christy mentioned, with changes in legislation, especially in BC with UNDRIP, with a comprehensive understanding of Section 35 rights. Like, we're seeing the need to look at things differently, and we're also faced with some challenges around climate. Also, when you look at the child welfare system and how there's child welfare reform, just this need to look at what colonization has done and how we need to transform and, look at Indigenous knowledge, value Indigenous knowledge. And so I do think a lot of this work is nested within this larger transformational system change. And so that's what makes it really, really exciting and really important, because all of these kinds of initiatives are little pieces that lead to something greater, right? And that we're all contributing when we're learning about this work, when we're attempting to do this work. But again, also, and I know we'll say this a couple times probably throughout the presentation, is, these legislation changes have come down, and, there is lots of work, and lots of different sectors are doing kind of community-based indicator work, but there really isn't a good how yet, right? Like, it still is very much evolving. And the landscape is constantly shifting, which again makes this work really exciting. And I think it just gets better and better as we move along. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Still on the topic of why this is important. So there's a greater emphasis on sustainability and resilience and looking into Indigenous knowledge. Obviously, in the past, we haven't had the incorporation of Indigenous knowledge was hindered by the processes and policies that sort of these, specifically in the resource extraction world, had to maneuver through. I think weaving the Indigenous knowledge and Western science components together in our socioeconomic baseline work and our community-based indicator work really defines a new way of approaching the human element. We're only talking about socioeconomics today, but it also redefines how we deal with our biophysical world as well. And that comes out more so in the community-based indicator work. But from the social side and the human side, there's a lot of aspects that value that incorporation or that weaving. And we've called it weaving for a couple reasons. One is that we're not interjecting. We just found the word weaving was such a graceful way of saying the interconnectedness that has to occur to have like a more holistic outcome. So it's nothing that we've tagged. It's just something for today's presentation. So when we talk about weaving kind of those two worlds, that's what we're talking about. And, sometimes indicators that are derived in Western science fall short of what they can possibly do. We've got work that recently was on, and we had an elder wanting to work within an indicator, a wildlife indicator, except for the wildlife species didn't exist as per Western science. But as per Indigenous knowledge, which we've had thousands of years of observation, the community has indicated that species is going to come back around, and they will be in this area within the project lifetime. And so using that Indigenous knowledge and the integration of these indicators, we can do some assessment on a wildlife species that's not necessarily in the region yet, but as per Indigenous knowledge and history and years of observation, we can actually look at a species that may have been, it would have been just ignored with our normal Western science process, which is problematic. And then I guess maybe I'll let Paula talk about the importance of the weaving and braiding of knowledge, and I'll just plug a little bit. I've recently written a book called Weaving Two Worlds, but in this context, we're talking about the Indigenous knowledge and Western science. So if I slip, I apologize. I keep actually saying that in normal life. But anyways, I'll let Paula talk about the weaving and the braiding of knowledge and the attempt to maneuver through that.
Yeah, no, thanks, Christy. And when Christy and I were preparing for this, we talked about the weaving quite a bit, and why that concept is really, really important. I think, when you're working with community, it's about relationships, right? It's about, you're looking at the world and your relationship to it and the world's relationship to you. And, with Western science, indicators sometimes loses the relational pieces and how that impacts culture and how, it impacts access or quality. And then again, how that begins to impact knowledge transfer, if you don't have access to sacred, places, or you lose language because the place, has been damaged. So there's nuances in the objectives, and the understanding of the impacts. You're taking, a kind of a conceptual framework, which is very relational, and then weaving it, with that Western science framework. And sometimes the two, you can't stick them in a box, right? Like you can't take, the one perspective, figure out some indicators, and then plunk them into a predefined structure. It just makes your head blow up because it doesn't work. And it doesn't capture what's meaningful for, both, from a Western science perspective or from an Indigenous knowledge or community perspective. But it's not that one should be privileged over the other, because they're both so important. And so that's why we talk so much about being able to weave those perspectives together, not to force one into the other, or to try and, take a system or some predefined structure and then say indigenize it, and add some Indigenous elements. It's not that. It's being able to be flexible and adaptable, and to pull those perspectives together into something that is holistic and braid those pieces. Yeah, and we'll use metaphors all throughout, because I think it's the only way to really talk about it, right? It's difficult otherwise, but I think that conceptual framework piece and those relationships, and how even the relationship with Western science is really important to capture when you're working with community, and understanding that is really important.
Awesome. I should mention too that as much as it seems like it comes naturally from Paula and myself and our team and others that probably really really understand how to weave Indigenous knowledge and Western science together, that it's extremely hard for others to grasp the concept, and it's evolving in its space. We've seen a lot of bias writing in respect to, and I think Paula alluded to it, was you want to, people are indigenizing sections or components, but they're not really getting to the grassroots of how to incorporate those two elements, because there may be internal bias towards Western science, or maybe there's the opposite, and it's that Western science doesn't have a place. So it's this practice and highlighting, I guess, just a bit of a self-reflection. And as a person that practices in this space, we always have to do a check-in to make sure that we're integrating equally and appropriately. And we'll talk about validation a little later, but in a way that's healthy and safe. So just wanted to highlight that, because I think sometimes it's not as simple as it sounds, especially because we are all humans, and I mean that's what we are good at. We're human scientists technically, but that leaving that bias at the door when you're writing. So we wanted to quickly just touch base in case we have anybody on the call that may not have an understanding about indicators and how they work. So for those that already do, this is a bit of a step back, but we thought we would just share this slide to kind of give an oversight of what an indicator is, because we're going to be talking about those, and we have been, and then sort of how it informs decision making. So basically, we encompass values and interests. We support the community to create the indicators that are quantifiable. There is a measurable component to indicators, just in order to do analysis. There are a lot of indicators that we work with that are really, really hard to measure, but we're looking at ways to be able to figure out how to measure those aspects. So sometimes indicators can be a bit difficult, but we maneuver through a way to be able to measure what the outcome is to make an informed decision. So they're measurable. Their values, which are foundational indicators, that they can be broad, they can be specific, they can be local. When we work with Indigenous communities, they're always coming from, not always, but a lot of times they're coming from a place of culture, a place of healing, a place of potentially a community's been displaced, so trauma. So we work a lot with the human element. So those are the ones that I was kind of alluding to that get a little bit more difficult. So Indigenous knowledge sometimes requires and Paul and I have been talking about the family of indicators. So we're not just looking at one indicator, we're looking at a collective indicators, just due to the complexity and the relationships that are within our Indigenous way of knowing. So we really take kind of this holistic wraparound look at indicators in our work, and just wanted to go back a step and make sure that everybody knew what we were talking about when we kind of talk about indicators. And please feel free. I cannot see anybody's hands up because I'm sharing my screen, but if you have any questions, jump in at any time. Paula, do you want to comment further on that slide?
I think, I mean, the only thing that I would comment on and just, you know, referring back to the other slide is that, when working with an environmental assessment or some, health assessments and things like that, is that, you start off with a set of values and interests. And, from a Western science perspective, it seems all very logical and the community does care about these things. You can go into the community and, for example, like air and water. And then, you might have a separate value for culture, right? And this is where the rub happens, is because at that very first step, when you're identifying those values and interests, it's nuanced and it's not the same. It's not the same worldview approaching those, right? So like if you take air, what is the relationship with air? How is the relationship, with what a person has with the air and how that impacts their culture? It's like that's the piece that you might be trying to measure is that nuanced relationship. And so right from that first step of identifying what those values and those interests and how you even create those families of indicators and structures and categories is where the rub can start, right? And that's, one of the first places that you need to take a look at and make sure that there is, a solid understanding and that when you're working with the community, that they're letting you know what are the values and how should you be understanding those values and interests. And then, flow, the indicators, the more specific things will flow from there. Yeah, I guess that's the piece, right? Is when doing community-based indicators is defining, letting the community define that piece is what makes this work powerful and interesting.
I'll give an example of a rub. In my family, my belief, I'm a rock hound. I've been in mining for like 25 years. I love rocks. But when I was raised, and I am still adhere to most of this, rocks are animate. And that's in that sense that we wouldn't even pick them up to take them home. They need to be there because the creator left them there. And so when you're transforming that bit of like internal personal like belief and knowledge, and that you're not supposed to move rocks, and then now I'm moving rocks or supporting moving rocks as a living, it's an interesting piece because as an indicator or a value, depending on the community, that those rocks are animate and they should not be moved. And so that's where you kind of see those two different, the cultural piece, I guess, playing a role in those values and interests as well. I don't know if that was a great example, but it's a good story.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, there might, another example, like of a rub might also be like a definition of like what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. So I grew up outside of Edmonton, and there's a refinery out there. So I'll use a personal example too. And on the weekends, that refinery stinks. And so the odor in the air it's perfectly fine. It's perfectly healthy, right? Like it's not harming us. And so, you know, from a Western science perspective, that is acceptable. From a kid wanting to go out and play, but you go outside and it stinks, so you don't really want to be out there, that's not an acceptable level, right? So it's a different definition. And so I think the same with any impacts to the land. There's a Western science of what is acceptable, and then there's a community definition of what is acceptable and how that impacts their daily lives and their relationship with the land. I just think, yeah.
That's a good example. Just a little bit on what we've heard, because I think it's really important to share that this is not obviously like derived from just Paul and I sitting together and deciding that we want to like do a raft of different work in a different way. It comes from comments and you know, concerns and the evolution of sort of our practice areas. So that was really important to like share this slide. So I'll just read it. It comes from a group of elders, but indicators that measured impact on our culture are always put in its own separate category rather than being integrated throughout. Culture, identity, social health, wellness indicators are closely integrated and related to wildlife, air, water, vegetation. They can't be distinguished from each other. And healing and generosity, reciprocity, or concept of stewardship are also integral to understanding what is meaningful for the community. So I think these comments really show the need to have the integration, but also share that you know, this is common dialogue that we're having with the nations and with like throughout Canada, and it's really important to like ground, I think, our work back to where, you know, these comments are coming from and how we can do a good job with this integration. We'll testify that it's an evolving process. It's starting a new way of looking at things because the door has been open for us at multiple levels to help facilitate this change. But it's only been in the last little while that we've been able to do this type of work, which has been super important to my soul. So yeah, I just wanted to put the slide up. I know Paula has a few comments on this as well, so I'll just pass it over to her.
Yeah, I think what these comments are showing us is the rub. Again, that rub. You know, when you're sitting with elders and you're having these conversations, and you know, you're going through the exercise of trying to identify indicators that we're in the midst of a paradigm shift. We're in this period of time where we're having to shift how we think about things that seem so obvious to us. I guess it's the only way I can think about it, right? Like, I guess that's what I don't know what the actual definition of a paradigm shift is. So, but it's real, you know, turning our brains around to think about the world really quite differently, or even what the challenges, the issues, what's actually important, shifting our thinking. And so, you know, for anyone who's been in the world of evaluation and indicators, which I'm assuming is everybody on this call, I'm sure you've heard, you know, what you measure matters, right? Like, that's a pretty common phrase. And so I think for so long, you know, when looking at the impacts on community, and especially in Indigenous communities, you know, we might have been measuring the wrong thing, right? And so because we're so focused on a certain measurement, and so all our risk mitigation, all the solutions that we're dreaming up, all the actions are related to what we're measuring. And so you'll you'll measure the positive outcomes or the negative outcomes related to that measurement while you're missing a really important piece because we weren't able to wrap our minds around, no, that was what was important. And we should have been measuring, you know, this aspect. And so then our brains around mitigation and solutions, and positive and negative outcomes don't think of those things. And so then there's all these unintended consequences because we weren't putting the magnifying glass on it. So I guess that's, yeah, where I think that's what these comments are showing, is that we're really being intentional about how we need to be measuring and what really matters, so that we're really working towards community health and well-being, and that, you know, the activities that are happening on the land are mutually beneficial for the people who are on the land, and you know, for the wildlife and the fish and air and water. Yeah.
I think we also need to think.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I guess I'm long-winded. One of the other things that I wanted to bring up too is related to language.
Yeah.
So, you know, this is all obviously in English, but I think also working with community, and especially when you're working with cultures, you know, that are not English speaking, is, you know, these words that we have up there, you know, we're limited right now through English, right? Your language impacts your worldview, how you see the world, how you understand the world. And a lot of these English words fall short of what is actually being meant, or what is actually needed. So although we don't have it there, I also just want to stress the importance of language and integrating a community's own language into this work, because of the limitations of English, and that translations, they fall short. They don't capture the true meaning. And when you're working with others, you know, to try and explain what an indicator is or what the value is, sometimes you have to go back to the original language.
Thanks, Paula. I was going to mention language because in so many ways, our language doesn't necessarily equate to the English form. It has like so many components to it, and without understanding that worldview tied to that language too is we're missing something. So it's super important. All right, respectful practices. We thought we would say why, and then we would kind of talk about some hows, and then we got a couple more slides, and then we'll open it up. Recognizing it's 2:40, it'll give us some time for some dialogue. So respectful practices, one of the biggest things that can cause concern or reservation or apprehension to disclose, I guess, values and concerns is the data sharing and how it's used. We have a lot of, you know, traditional land use work that we work within, or knowledge keepers information that they really need to feel comfortable that it's going to be used in a good way and in a safe way. And also to, you know, look at how that is being used and making sure the context still remains. I feel like sometimes I always call it data mine nations. We're surveyed out, we're surveyed a lot. And that information is plunked here, and somebody else is using it to do an analysis. Whereas when we are sharing information, that's tied to the land, that's tied to our worldview, the context can totally take a 180. And it's super important to have these data sharing arrangements or agreements or things in place to protect not only the community, but also the person that's going to be writing it. Creating safe space for dialogue. This is my number one, not rant, but push all the time, is ensuring that we're not placing burden on a community. We're creating a safe, trauma-informed space where we can have open dialogue, where we can acknowledge that some things, and a lot of times there's moments where there are triggers, and making sure staff is like prepped and skilled and trained in trauma-informed spaces or safe spaces or any of those types of programs or workshops. Super important, because a lot of the work that we're doing is with communities that have been displaced, or communities' health and well-being that is pressured. There's a lot of or children and family being kind of ripped apart. So it's really important to have that safe space for dialogue. And that's one of the biggest things I think in our reservation sometimes, to like disclosing information, is it's been used wrong, or it's been extracted in a harmful way, or or the context is totally changed. So just something to keep in mind. Time is another one. Time is a very much a colonial construct. A lot of these things that we are working within have schedules. It takes a lot of time to talk about indicators, have the proper engagement, develop those safe spaces and environments to do the work that we do. And I really think, at least from some of the work we're doing in extractive resource sector, that time is not considered well. It is an area where we need to look at, like, when these type of processes start. Normally it's like, oh, we need a project, here's this, and here you go. You got 6 months to extrapolate community-based indicators to inform the process. Doesn't quite align all the time with the nations, nor does it allow for those safe spaces, which is super important. OCAP, of course, who owns the information. So ownership, control, access, and possession. And again, that's another area where I feel, of course, the data sharing agreement is great, but also where we've been apprehensive about providing information is because we tend to lose perceived ownership or ownership over it. And this information is community-based. So one of the things that our team, and I think there's several of our teammates on here today, but like Jen and Fauzi and Paul and myself have really worked hard to do, is ensure we're working with the community to say, like, this is your information. This stuff is like the information we're gathering, the context within it, like with where it sits, is your information. And we've got nations now that have like taken ownership of the information, and when extractive resource or other entities come in, they're actually saying, like, look, we have this information, we'll provide you with levels of access at a cost, and here's how it works out. So there's different communities doing different things, I guess I'd say, with the information that we're gathering. It's not just typical being extrapolated off the website, put into a socioeconomic baseline report using census data, which is used as primary data in most of those cases, and being integrated into a project process. And it's just not valuable.
No. Oh my God.
And then we talked a little bit about validation of information. So how this is done. This is a bit of a tricky part of the process, and I'm sure Paula will comment after this. Like how like not all community members come out for these sessions. We know this. My community, we have like the same maybe 20 people that come out to like support and provide context to certain areas, and then the information is used in a certain way or for a certain project, and then other members potentially disagree. So how do we manage that piece? And that's the validation. It's like going back to the community, ensuring what has been written is correct, having those checks and balances, all those things in place. So it's super important. So these are just some respectful practices. There's probably a million more, but just something that Paul and I felt was important to raise today were these 5. And especially around time, validation, ownership, and safe spaces. So Paula, do you want to comment at all on that?
I don't think I'll comment on the validation because it is a tricky piece when you're working with community and you're bringing together diversity of thoughts and opinions and approaches and managing all those pieces and making sure that you're not privileging one voice or a small group of voices over everybody else. So it's a fine balance. It's tricky. And I am interested in hearing groups' thoughts, the people on this call, what they think. But I think the one piece that I did want to raise in coming back to time also is when you're working with community, it's not like you're working with professionals, right? The way that information is shared is different. And when I say when I say professionals, I mean they're professionals in their own. As a community and experts in knowledge. I just, when it's information is shared through stories, information is shared through experiences. It's not always you ask a question and you're going to get a straight answer. There's a lot of really listening and really hearing what's being said in order to pull out what's important and what's meaningful. And it takes a couple tries sometimes to get it right. And that's also the validation piece, because it's not like the indicators are always going to be straightforward. To pull that information out takes effort and time and investment. And so that's all I just wanted to say on that.
Active listening and listening to silence. I always say some of the silence is the best way of like hearing things. I put this slide in for a multitude of reasons. So many times I see like short little projects or 20-year mine life projects or, other work being done that has a very short life that these indicators are feeding into. And what is being like missed is the perception or the ability to apply it to 7 generations. And this is just our thoughts and my thoughts within respect to 7 generational thinking. And I know it is a collective thought, but I'm not saying it's everyone's thought throughout our Indigenous communities. But so impacts on land are super personal. We have deep relations to the land. That just can't be shown through modeling or shown through air quality or shown through water quality. This takes we've got that element of looking 7 generations ahead when we're making decisions, and plunking a 20-year project in 7 generations just doesn't make sense from a thought process unless you look at the full 7 generations. we've been working really close with some proponents to actually support them in developing their mine life outlook to be 7 generational in perspective. So it's not just like, oh, it's a 20-year mine life, and then we're going to be doing water quality for in perpetuity or whatever. That they're starting to use the 7 generational language. And we've noticed that it's been more, it's more of an understanding piece, I think, between the Indigenous knowledge and through the Western science approach when both sides are starting to use that type of language. So I just wanted to put this in. We apply a long perspective, obviously, when we're looking at community-based indicators and socioeconomic work. The temporal factor is really, really important. And, but we're starting to see this as a bit of, and we'll go back to that word paradigm shift, but it's got to be looked at from all perspectives when we're feeding into a project. It just can't be one. The Indigenous knowledge is looking at 7 generations, and then the mine life's 20 years, and how does that apply? If you can look at 7 generations of what that site is going to look like, that tells a different story. And I'll speak really briefly on this, but I'm going to get Paula to talk about this because this is more the work that she does. So it's more on the working with the community to design that conceptual framework to like actually weave the Indigenous knowledge and the Western science together at a grassroots based level. And maybe I'll just actually pass it over to her right now to describe like the example that we provided and some of the conceptual framework aspects.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just looking at the time and I'm like, oh,
yeah.
Explain this. No, I think one of the things and why we put this slide up is also the importance of using visuals to make concepts, to make what you're hearing really accessible for the people that you're working with. That you're not using all your jargon, you're not when you see something visually, it helps. It just helps with the understanding of what you're doing and what you're trying to do. So I guess in just showing this is the weaving concept of where, on the one side, we see, some Western science values of what's important, for people and wildlife and air, and that there's indicators within those that need to be measured to understand impacts and to help with risk mitigations. When you bring these forward to community, or when I've brought this forward to community, what the values are about rights and title and well-being and resilience and passing knowledge on to future generations and, the impacts to language. And that's when you see that, you can't just think about water and people and wildlife separate to teachings. They become integrated and they become woven, same as teachings. You can't make that separate from just people, right? That these are components and aspects and values and interests that are all very important and need to come together and be understood in an integrated way so that those indicators are actually meaningful, so they're actually useful for communities and for mines, so that it's a mutually beneficial exercise to be measuring these indicators. And on the one side, when we talk about healing, and then on the other side, the piece around generosity, reciprocity, and stewardship, it's also when you're working with communities, you're often talking about healing and restoring in the same way that you're talking about how you're giving back and taking care of the land and, you know, your reciprocal relationship to the land as part of well-being and identity. So just that there's, it's not just about impacts. You're not just measuring impacts. You are measuring healing and restoration and reclamation, just as much as your indicators are guiding your way forward for, you know, taking care of the land and giving back and all those pieces. So yeah, so I just wanted to talk about how, you know, to take a concept and how you can weave those together and the importance of making it visual for people.
Awesome. And remarks. So we've got 3 minutes. Again, like we said, this is an evolving practice. The calls to action, UNDRIV, truth and reconciliation. I mean, all that is like, you know, just very, very new and new in a lot of spaces. So these types of shifts and the ways that we're allowed to do, I don't say I'm allowed to do the work. I don't know what the right term would be, that this practice is evolving for a multitude of reasons, and we can communicate now into some of those processes using this. So that's the real value for this. We need to learn from each other. Like every single community that we've worked within has approached this differently, has it, you know, wholeheartedly expressed themselves differently. As you know, obviously we're not all the same nation. There's no pan-Indian, or I avoid the pan-Indianism aspect. It's very, very clear when you start to do this work in each of the communities how different our values are. And we need to do this in a way that, like I said, is safe, is meaningful. You know, we are currently feeding this information into a lot of colonial constructs, into an environmental assessment or into policy and process design or all these different things. And it's extremely hard to articulate some of this in a written form to decision makers. And so as we're starting to like maneuver through this integration or this weaving of knowledge, we will find ways to communicate what is meaningful. And I think we really have. I think we've come a long ways just in the couple of years that we've been, you know, working within this different, these different parameters. But we have a long, long way to go. And I think it's going to take a huge collaboration. I think there's a lot of healing that still needs to occur with respect to the integration of Western science and Indigenous knowledge. I think there's a lot of healing that, you know, is coming out of some of this dialogue that we do. And so it's evolving, it's exciting. I hope we gave you some insight and some things to think about. Yeah. And I guess that's it from us. Yeah, there's like 0 seconds to ask questions.
I mean, you had to cover a lot of ground this afternoon. So do you guys have a contact, like information you want to throw out there?
Yeah, I can do it in the chat.
Okay.
Absolutely. And I didn't see if we had any questions. I missed examples and metaphorical speak. Give it examples. I'm going to put my email in here. There you go. Put on, Christy.
Thank you so much. So this presentation is going to be sent to all of you. There is an evaluation form, so please, please, please fill that out. We love to hear your voice. We love to hear your feedback. And then there is Christy's email and Paula's email. So if you have any questions, feel free to shoot them an email. You know, I really, really loved the language of weaving, you know, our belief systems into that Western science. And I just think that that's important, and that's a great word. I also, you know, in the middle of today's presentation, really thought about how everything is interconnected. So of course, you know, we're gonna find spaces where we are interconnected, where there's familiarities, but also, you know, trying to bring in some of that Indigenous knowledge as well. And then the one piece that you said, Paula, about language, sometimes that, you know, English language disappoints us or doesn't measure up. And, you know, it's our languages that really capture, you know, the meaning that we're looking for. And that just hit home for me too, and why language is so important. Oh man, you covered so much ground this afternoon. Thank you so much. Again, the chat box is blowing up. So thank you. Awesome presentation. Well done. Oh yeah, unprecedented inclusivity.
Mm-hmm.
A great word. All right. Well, thank you all. You've given us much to think about, right? Like these webinars are really about sharing of knowledge. And so we really appreciate that you've shared your knowledge. You've inspired us. You got us to think a little bit deeper about our own practices and what's going on in our own nations and our own organizations. So thank you so much first and foremost of what you're doing in our world and creators world, that you're doing the good work, the hard work. And sometimes it requires you to dig deep. No pun intended, Christy. Sometimes it requires to dig a little bit deeper, right? To have those really meaningful conversations that sometimes can be super hard. So thank you for all that you do. Thank you for sharing your knowledge today. And we're just honored that you have been with us. So thank you all for joining us. We hope to see you again. Continue to walk in a good way. Honor yourself, creator, and the circle and the world around you. So take care, everyone. Peace.